As our culture shifts from live shows to live streams, the Chicago Cultural Alliance finds it more important than ever to dive back into our roots, to create a platform that welcomes tough conversations, and to share our cultural stories of resilience. Welcome to Cultural Connections. Welcome to Cultural Connections. This is a visual podcast, and we've designed this to raise the voices of the Alliance members and supporters within the Chicago Cultural Alliance. And in each of these episodes, we'll be hearing from a different cultural perspective about topics related to diversity and inclusion and equity. And I'm excited to have our next guest, Kathleen Mcdonald, who is the former executive director at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian. Welcome, Kathleen. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're excited to have you here. And so you were the recent executive director at the Mitchell Museum. And how long were you there?
I was there over 10 years. I started in 2009 and just finished up in August.
Excellent. And what brought you to that museum? What drew you to the Mitchell Museum?
Well, I've always been really passionate about museums, mainly history museums, places that tell stories about people and do so through objects that are these great touchstones. And so it happened that I was living about a mile from the museum and was at home with my two boys. And when they were ready to get back in school, it coincided with an opening for the director position there. So that's really how I ended up there. So it was really a bit of serendipity, but I'd always worked with some Native collections in the various history museums that I'd worked in previously. And so it really seemed to give me a great opportunity to learn about so many new cultures that it was really exciting to get into that.
You mentioned your previous experience and career as a museum professional, and actually part of that started here. We're at the Chicago History Museum right now. So you were a public historian at that point at the Chicago History Museum?
So I actually started here as an intern in the costume department. And then my first full-time position was as an assistant curator of decorative and industrial arts. Wow. And that no longer exists here. They did a big reorganization, and a lot of the curators become public historians. So I was a public historian for exhibition development for several years.
Obviously, you know, the reason we invited you here today is you have a long career in the museum sector, and unfortunately did have to cancel our annual gala this year, Mosaic, which we usually host in May. And during our Activating Heritage Conference, we ask our core members to vote and nominate somebody for our Outstanding Community Leader Award. And this year you were selected along with Sulan Moy, and congratulations on your award.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. And this award is obviously something that, we admire as an alliance, as a way to show the individual's positive impact on community. And so obviously you've had a wonderful impact on the museum community over the years. You've been a leader in the space for a long time, a role model for many. I'm curious what drew you to just the museum professional outside of stories. What was it that drew you to museums? Because it's a tough industry to be in at the same time too.
It really is a special place. And I grew up going to museums around Chicago. We would be enticed to go to the Art Institute, buy Luminati's pizza or Due's pizza. And it really just became something that I learned to really appreciate, seeing the objects and being able to learn more in depth about them in ways that you don't get in school or other types of formats.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really experience it the same way online.
Mm-hmm.
You have to see it in person. And
Yeah.
that kind of experience I really enjoyed. And so, as a fluke, while I was in college, I decided to do an internship at the Museum of Science and Industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a whole career planned in corporate law. And this was just, I was doing a double major and a minor in 4 years. So I had to do some summer classes, but I couldn't do a full time job. It was difficult to pan out. So I thought, well, I'll intern at a museum. That sounds like a load of fun. And I thought maybe after my career, I could work in
Mm-hmm.
volunteer at a museum or something like that. But I never really thought it was a career opportunity
Mm-hmm.
until I did that internship.
Mm-hmm.
And I just loved the working environment. There's so many engaged people that work in museums that are really vested in their communities, in making the world a more beautiful place, but a more thoughtful place.
Mm-hmm.
And that really changed the trajectory of my career at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
I went back to Lehigh University and was surprised to discover they had some museum studies classes.
Mm-hmm.
And, I quickly signed up for those and then went on to graduate school at GW
Mm-hmm.
in Washington, D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
and did many, many more internships.
Yeah. As you
And
do.
I did 6 internships.
Yeah.
So the last one was here at the Chicago History Museum.
Excellent. Yeah.
And that really gave me some nice introductions to
Mm-hmm.
the staff
Mm-hmm.
and really helped me earn my position here.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and your story, career path is not too far different from mine as well. Working in the museum sector, I thought I was going to be a teacher, so I went to school to do that. Then left teaching because I wasn't too excited about working in public schools, but I still wanted education as part of
yeah.
my career, and so I found a museum studies program too, and went back to school, and it was from there that it was actually at an internship in college too that set me to even think about the museum sector as a career path. Because same thing, growing up, I went to all the museums in New York, Museum of Natural History, all of these beautiful places, but never thought of a career in a museum. And it is a wonderful place to be in a unique industry that does challenge and think of a lot of thoughtful ways to have conversations that are a little bit more difficult to have in life. And I think that's what really drew me is how objects and how collections can tell stories that we don't hear about every day. That it's going to be completely different. And so I appreciate that. It's a beautiful thing to have those kind of stories. I'm
going to jump in
Yeah,
too,
absolutely.
because I know we've just been glorifying this field, but I always like to give a bit of a caveat when I'm talking
all about it.
to younger folks looking to go into the field that it is very competitive to get a full-time position. And you have to be aware of that when you sign up for these programs, because the entry point is you really have to have a master's. And you don't necessarily need a PhD for most positions, but you really need a master's. And you also need work experience. And it's like this catch-22. You've got to pay all this money to get your degree, but then you've got to work for nothing to get started, to get the work experience, to get into the higher level positions. And it's certainly doable, but you need to know that up front.
Yeah, no, it is totally true. And it isn't an easy path to take too, because I grew up in the Bronx and I didn't have access to as many organizations that had programs like museum studies, because it's few and far between. So to even just get that experience of a museum studies program is hard to find. And then the internships, working for free at a museum or a cultural center, I did probably about 4 or 5 different internships before I was able to get a job there. It's not an easy path to go down at all. And you know, it does leave some room for inequity in there too, a bit, because unfortunately,
Yeah,
not everyone is able to do some of the free, you know, or free work and
absolutely.
labor of internships. So there are obviously barriers there, but there's also, you know, a lot of change that's needed in that a bit, I think, too.
I'll give those folks a big tip here
Yeah.
because even if you're volunteering a Saturday a week
Hmm.
and you've got a full-time job
Yeah.
during the week, that still
Yeah.
counts as so many months of an
Yeah.
internship. No
Yeah.
one's going to know
No.
whether you were there full-time or one
Hmm.
day a week.
Yeah.
So,
And the biggest thing that I appreciated from the internships too was the networking and the people that you meet.
absolutely.
Because if you don't do that, you're not gonna be involved with the
Yeah,
community and get to know people to
right.
find new opportunities. And so that is huge.
Yeah.
So even just one day a week at an
Yep.
internship at any organization, if you're interested in the museum sector, is huge
Yeah.
to make that change. So yeah, I truly appreciate that. I would love to talk a little bit about, you know, we at the Chicago Cultural Alliance are an organization of 40 cultural heritage centers. I'm curious just what your involvement has been with the Alliance over the years. I am, you know, just starting here. It's been maybe 3 years now that I've been with the Alliance,
Hmm.
but you've have some history with the organization. So what things have you worked on and been interested in with the Alliance over the years?
So I really got engaged with the Alliance in 2009 when I became the
Hmm.
director at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian. And the first couple of years was very much about getting to meet all of the wonderful organizations that are involved with CCA. And it became a really wonderful resource of peers to reach out to and grow with. And so the first couple things I did were really I was a speaker at two different programs,
Hmm.
collections, storage, and care for small museums,
Hmm.
and then another program that was done at the Chicago Cultural Center that was on identity and global fashion,
Mm.
and that happened right after we had put on an exhibit on native haute couture.
Mm.
So it was really
Awesome.
very fresh
Yeah.
and a great topic to delve into.
Yeah, I
And
love
there were
that.
a number of panelists from different cultural groups.
Mhm.
So it was really neat to have an opportunity to share the commonalities as well as some of the unique aspects.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's what we really hope to accomplish with this podcast, as well as we continue it on in the future, hopefully, is to have cross-cultural conversations
Right.
as well. Because I think that's one of the unique elements of the alliance that I found in
Mm-hmm.
stepping into the organization is cross-cultural conversations really do give you an insight to topics that you would talk about normally to people, but also you're finding a fully different perspective. Some of the examples that I loved to talk about was, you know, I was told at the Field Museum when Cultural Connections was
Mm-hmm.
there that some of the topics they talk about are about like weddings and how weddings can be different from every
Yeah.
different cultural perspective. And it's just, it is definitely gives you a new light on topics that you
Mm-hmm.
think you feel comfortable with. But there's so many different ways of looking at it. And that really is a beautiful part of the programming that comes
Right.
from many of the cultural heritage centers and museums that the Alliance works with, is that cross-cultural programming. It's beautiful. Is there something that you know, maybe you didn't participate in or experience at a program at
Well, I think
Alliance?
the other areas that I worked on, which is exactly what you're saying,
Hmm.
and that's the Inherit Chicago
Hmm.
programming. And the first year we did two programs, a program series with the Southside Community Arts Center, and it was on finding your Indigenous roots, a discourse with the African American and Native American
Beautiful.
communities. And it was really interesting because the stories of trying to find your ancestry when there's been so much tragedy and broken history,
Hmm.
getting those records to trace back your family roots.
Hmm.
It's a very common story with African Americans. experiencing slavery. And it's a very common story with Indigenous people as well,
Yeah.
because of removal and boarding schools and all these pieces of history that took away their roots and a lot of their ability to trace their background.
Yeah.
So we had some genealogists come and join us at the first section, and people from each community really discussing that. And it was a wonderful collaboration. And CCA was really pivotal in bringing our organizations together because we're in very different parts of the city. Mitchell Museum is on the north of the city in Evanston, and Southside Community Center is all the way south. And
Bronzeville, yeah.
we did buses so that groups from each organization and audiences could really come, and it was great to see people go to both sessions. So that was really terrific.
I love that story. Thank you, because that is a perfect example of just how the difficult conversations around slavery and genocide and all of that stuff, and cultures that can connect on trauma, but also connect on just their own history and try to discover their own history together. It's beautiful to see that play out.
Well, one of the things I really liked about that is it took that history, but it showed audience members a very practical aspect about how it plays out for them today, and how tracing their roots, the complications in that is really based on that history. And, so learning from people how to get around that is really, I thought, very helpful for people today.
Right.
Another Inherit Chicago program that we did was last year on repatriation. And this started with a conversation that Irene Faulkner began at one of the CCA meetings. And again, commonalities across many different cultures that CCA has within its member organizations. And repatriation is something that is federal law in the U.S. for Native Americans, the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protections Act. And but this has happened in many other countries, particularly countries throughout Africa and in China, but all over the world you see examples of this. And more recently in news headlines today, you can see how organizations and countries are starting to return the cultural patrimony and how significant those small first steps are. So initially, we came together to do an Inherit Chicago program with the Ethiopian Community Center of Chicago and the Chinese American Museum of Chicago, and that was hosted, and the Mitchell Museum, and that was hosted at the Hellenic Museum. And we did a panel discussion with speakers from each of those groups. We also did a pop-up exhibit because the subject matters, you really need to understand the history of what's happened to kind of get why museums should return objects that they own. So it was really important to have that information in print that people could read beforehand, but also come back to afterwards. And during all of these planning discussions, I really wanted to see it become a full-fledged exhibit and potentially travel that.
It was so close.
Yeah. So what Peter's alluding to there is that we had to close because of COVID 2 days before the opening.
It was so close.
So close. It's up. It's just,
But nobody's
it's
seen
there.
it yet. Oh.
It's there. But yeah, so we ended up developing the exhibit, and that partnership expanded more into other CCA organizations. And we brought in the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center to talk about Nazi looted art. We also brought in the Field Museum to help us with some of the Native American stories. And Helen Robbins was really terrific. She's their repatriation coordinator. And so it really was a wonderful partnership that developed out of the folks that we work with through CCA.
Repatriation is a challenging conversation to have, and that's
Absolutely.
another area that a lot of our members, a lot of the members that we work with, have conversations that they have stories that they want to share. about how difficult that has been for their individual cultures, from the Greek stories from the
Right.
National Hellenic Museum to
Mm-hmm.
indigenous peoples, and the burial and removal of
Yeah.
their ancestors. It goes from objects to people. It's a
Literally.
really complicated
Yeah.
conversation. So to hear that from different cultural perspectives, I attended that
Mm-hmm.
program, and it's really powerful to hear one conversation about the woman that came in from Canada
Yeah.
to talk about the Indigenous people of Canada
Yeah.
and
Jody Simkin.
and the repatriation of the remains, seeing the breadth of other conversations that come from there.
Yeah.
It was a really important moment, and I think more museums need to be having that conversation,
Right.
because repatriation, it's complicated to give back the objects, and there are things that museums want to do to support. But really, at the end of the day, it's about the communities. It's about giving back
Yeah.
their history and giving them their own voices back to tell their own stories with the objects that are theirs.
Yeah.
And brings up a very big topic about museums in general, and just how museums came to exist in the
Absolutely.
first place was because of a lot of the looting
Yeah.
that happens, and we're still kind of feeling some of that today, right? It's such a present conversation.
Absolutely.
These museums and large institutions sought out objects from other cultures, brought it to their institutions to show and to preserve. But to give that back, it's what is needed. And
Yeah.
we're hearing, as you mentioned, a lot more conversations about this in museums
Mm-hmm.
today. Has there been something that you've heard that has been fascinating about what a museum has given back, or how they have given it back in some way?
There are a
A
lot
lot,
of
yeah.
stories
Yeah.
right now of museums giving things back, and certainly within Native communities in the U.S. with the NAGPRA that started in the 90s and 1990, it became federal law. A lot of museums across the U.S. have a legal responsibility to go through their collections and create lists and notify tribes of what they have. And so there is an obligation to bring things back, but often it's complicated in what you do in your cataloging over, 150 years, 300 years,
Mm-hmm.
to have it documented to know which tribe to return things
Mm-hmm.
to. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to get across in the exhibit are some of the collaborations that some of the tribes are doing now to work together and say, we know that these are ancestors
Mm-hmm.
from people from our area,
Mm-hmm.
and several tribes lived in this area over that time period. We're going to come together and figure out an appropriate way that we can all agree on to bury our ancestor and
Mm-hmm.
bring them back home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so much nicer to see that
Mm-hmm.
than the legal battles of whose
Who's
remains are these
Yeah.
and what territory they controlled
Mm-hmm.
when. I think the most important thing is to get these pieces back where they belong,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with the materials that were raided from graves.
Yeah.
And
So
it's quite different from, a cup
yeah.
that may have been taken. And um, those are that's a level that I think needs to happen
Mm-hmm.
immediately. So I
Yeah.
love when those collaborations come
Mm-hmm.
together, and people, it seems on the surface like it's a not doable thing because there's no way to know
Mm-hmm.
exactly, which tribe that person's from. But for folks to come together and say, we know what the higher
Mm-hmm.
purpose is here,
Yeah.
and we know where we need to get to. So
Yeah.
let's just set all this ownership
Mm-hmm.
aside and say the body needs to come back
Mm-hmm.
home.
Yeah, no, it's um, the idea of having your ancestors brought home and doing that as a group collectively
Hmm.
makes so much sense when it's such important history that unfortunately was lost because of a lot of the looting. To
Yeah.
come together and bring people home that way is a beautiful story. And you're right, it needs to be done that specifically with human remains. We've talked a little bit about just museums as an institution,
Hmm.
and I'm curious. We're struggling right now. A lot of
Yeah.
organizations in the alliance are struggling. The alliance itself, as a nonprofit, all nonprofits
Hmm.
are having a hard time these days because of lack of attendance, lack of programming. There's no new revenue streams, and we're very dependent on foundation funding and
Right.
grants.
Hmm.
And that's not the most exciting way to run an organization, is to be that dependent on some of these foundations. You and I spoke a bit about, at our Activating Heritage conference, we brought together foundations to talk about, and cultural centers to talk about equity within
Hmm.
giving to specifically smaller and medium-sized cultural heritage museums.
Hmm.
I'm curious, what thoughts do you have there in terms of how foundations can be more thoughtful in who they're providing funds
Hmm.
to, because shouldn't be the large places all the time. There's a lot of other organizations that could use the support, especially today.
Well, I have a number
Hmm.
of responses to that. And first, I really want to cheer on the small organizations because um, as a small museum director, I've seen firsthand how quickly we pivot to be able to have conversations with the public about very current issues. You try and do an exhibit at the Smithsonian that is going to talk about something you saw in the headlines 2 months ago, and you're going to be 3 years later.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of
Hmm.
their planning process
Yeah.
and doing
Yeah.
their business. We can put together
Your
things in
repatriation
months,
exhibition, yeah, it
yes,
came
in a few
together.
months.
Yeah.
And we look at, we don't have enough money to hire outside people to do all this stuff
Hmm.
and the fancy bells and whistles. But the most important core thing is to get these ideas out there, to get the objects out there for people to experience, and to really share a vantage point that's unique and a deeper history on the contemporary topics, because it gives people more tools to really talk
Hmm.
about, informed, and have an informed conversation of what's happening today.
Hmm.
So I always think it's really important to have a handle on what's going on at people's dinner conversations,
Hmm.
what folks are chatting about at the water cooler,
Hmm.
and what's sort of the next coming arena that we need to be looking at. And I feel like I've been able to do that in several exhibits throughout my career, and it's
Right.
been really exciting to do that, and really exciting to see the feedback and the amount of engagement that visitors have,
Hmm.
because it's so relevant to them in the moment.
Yeah.
So foundations look at these small museums because they are doing amazing work, and they do it on a shoestring budget. So, whatever dollar you're giving them, it is going to
Going to
great
use.
use. But on the flip side, with small organizations and even medium sized
Hmm.
organizations, so often foundations have been focused on wanting a particular program to happen, and they're going to fund the program.
Hmm.
They don't want to cover operations. And I was so grateful to foundations like the Richard H. Driehaus
Hmm.
Foundation, supported through the MacArthur
Hmm.
Arts and Culture Fund, and several others that really provided sustained giving for operating money, and they got it. And fortunately, over the last 5 years, I've noticed many more foundations that have started doing listening sessions. I always try and say, operating money is the best because we need to pay for staff that come up with these brilliant ideas. But if we're doing exhibits that are going to talk about really current issues, we can't do that kind of current, relevant conversations if it's going to take a year for us to get the funding to know we can put it together in that way. So if we have operating money up front, if you believe in what we do, then we can turn it around in those tighter timetables and be most relevant to our audiences and to have the conversations that they want to have, to become a community space that comes in and discovers, there's a deeper history here that I didn't know about, but what they're talking on the news doesn't tell me the whole story.
No,
And I think that's so important today, that folks can see a longer range of history.
Yeah,
And
today it's more important than it ever has been during this time, during COVID and all of our really, really important conversations on racial justice today. Museums have the ability to participate in these conversations, and they should be doing that more. And I've seen from the Alliance's perspective, the members that we work with, the cultural heritage institutions, they've all embraced that and have been able to pivot, as you say, their conversations to talk about present topics. I don't see that coming from as many of the larger institutions today.
they can't.
Because you're right.
Well, they can.
They
but
can.
They can, and
But
I've done
takes
it.
a long time. You're right. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get through the bureaucracy of the institution to tell these stories. And it is a wonderful thing that smaller, mid-size, neighborhood-based institutions here in Chicago can really tell those stories immediately. They are actually going out to the communities right now, collecting their stories in the moments and able to retell that immediately. It's beautiful. And that is one of the things that I appreciate most about smaller institutions, as you say, is that they do have that flexibility. And it's important for funding organizations to note that too, that they if they are interested in participating in these conversations at present, some of these smaller organizations are going to be the ones that can do that immediately. And the more money put there, the more that we're going to hear directly from the voices of the community themselves. As opposed to some of these larger institutions where voices can get lost a bit. So I'm thank you for sharing that note. This idea of funding in the nonprofit sector is such a complicated conversation now today. We are entering 2021 with a lot of unknowns. But I'm curious about what these stories of hope from these smaller institutions. I'm curious what you're excited to see to come from that in the near future, because there are some really amazing things happening right now that I think will shift in the years to come on how museums and smaller institutions are telling stories. Are there things that you're excited to see happen in the near future?
Well, I know the Mitchell Museum had to close in March. It's still not open to the public. So reopening is probably a very exciting thing. Before I left, I was working on a program to do online tours for schools and really transform our tour base to do things in the classroom and have native docents be able to go on Zoom or whatever platform and speak directly to the students that are doing sort of the video tours and answer questions live. It's kind of groundbreaking in the sense that you suddenly have this opportunity to, the Mitchell Museum covers all of the tribes within the US and Canada, but not everybody can get to the
Hmm.
museum.
Hmm.
And some of that's, distance. We used to get tour groups from Indiana,
Hmm.
Kenosha, Wisconsin,
Hmm.
Rockford, Illinois on a regular basis.
Hmm.
And the last several years, the cost of busing has gone up so much. The schools have not been able to come from those distances. So our pool has been shrinking. And COVID has really forced the Mitchell Museum, as well as many other organizations, to think of new ways to engaging audiences. And now all of a sudden to be able to potentially offer these online tours, you've just exploded
Hmm.
the radius of
Hmm.
your outreach.
Yeah.
So now we can reach the range of our mission, which is over 1,200
Hmm.
diverse tribes
Yeah.
across the US and Canada, and to promote these services and
Hmm.
opportunities for students all over.
Yeah.
And before it was much, much more limited.
Yeah.
And I know the museum has done a lot of work on projects that have a big range.
Mhm.
We often will show how tribes from different regions, express their culture in jewelry or in regalia
Mhm.
and fashion. Um, but we don't always get such a national audience.
Mhm.
And we've been fortunate to have some national media coverage at the museum because of that. But people do find out about us.
Yeah.
And so we do get visitors from across the country, but international visitors as
Yeah.
well.
And expanding that now is going to be huge for a lot
Yeah,
of, especially here in Chicago, we do have a lot of neighborhood-based organizations that
right,
often get overlooked, unfortunately, because they're not downtown, the
right.
immediately accessible
Mm-hmm.
museums that are downtown. These are
Mm-hmm.
all, you have to take public transit to get to them, and there
Right.
are limitations for people, tourists especially, doing that.
Yeah,
Now, all of these organizations can reach audiences all over the world, and there's
absolutely.
such a uh, opportunity here digitally to reach more
Yeah.
audiences. We're hearing stories like that now. We're
Mm-hmm.
starting to hear, some of the member organizations that we work with are getting people from, internationally join their programs and online
Mm-hmm.
webinars and that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
it was an unexpected
Mm-hmm.
pleasure of all of this to expand that reach. But it truly, you're right. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to that as well. And as we move forward, many organizations have been able to take on some of these digital tools to expand their audience reach.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking about foundations and that, the more that we can get some money going towards digital to
Mm-hmm.
support cultural heritage organizations with their digital needs is going to be big, because
Yeah.
as you know, before that there wasn't much of a digital presence for many of these organizations, right?
Absolutely.
It was a moment in time that we all had to pause and say we have to go online, and we didn't have all those resources before.
Right.
um, but slowly, it
Yeah.
took a little while, a few months of getting things together. But now
Yeah.
almost all of the members within the alliance are online and
Mm-hmm.
have an online presence, and I'm excited to see that growth. Well, I want to congratulate you again for joining us and for having received this award as an outstanding community leader. You have had a wonderful career, obviously. I was excited to talk to you about all of this, to share with everyone what you've contributed as an individual too. Are there any parting words that you'd like to give about receiving your award and that?
I just want to thank everyone at CCA, but also thank all of the folks that I've worked with throughout my career, because it's been a really amazing journey. And it's really benefited from everyone that's touched on that, with the opportunities to really reach out to do exhibits that don't always fit the norm, and really get those opportunities to stretch and show the creativity that we can do as a museum industry. And I think there's a lot of great things that could be ahead.
Yeah.
And as you say, those funders get behind this
Yeah.
because museums are really special places. And I know when after the pandemic hit, American Alliance of Museums did a survey of museum directors, and they came out with 1/3 of the directors saying that they thought they may permanently close because of COVID-19. And that is a really scary number, a really scary number. And think about where your communities are going to go to experience the joy of art and to have these more in-depth conversations. And to have these experiences that you share with your family and whatever group you bring as your family. So I really had a great time working in museums, and it's really a privilege to get this award.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We're excited to honor you, and yes, this collaborative spirit of museums working together to solve some of the and to solve some of the larger problems that we're facing in the world, and to have some of these difficult conversations. People think of museums as just collecting objects, but it's so much more than that. There is so much more that you can bring to the table in terms of having really exciting and courageous and challenging conversations to really address a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. And I really do look forward to seeing how museums can help us solve a lot of these challenges. So thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining us today, and we really appreciate you being here, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Peter.